Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be participating in this conference. So my talk is called Global Justice and the Energy Transition. And I really started from the premise that was given in the instructions to the panel to answer the question of, is inequality an independent factor in global risk, independent from terror and error? And I'll just give you a quick roadmap of the talk here today. I'm going to start with some overview of the trends and regimes, what I'll call regimes of global inequality. I'm going to show you that rising inequality, I'm going to argue that rising inequality increases the risk of global catastrophe. And then this is going to put us in a little bit of a dilemma, because I'm going to suggest that the most expedient form of decarbonization probably increases global inequality. And then all I can do in the time that we have here today is really pose this very difficult overarching question, which is, what does decarbonization that reduces global inequality like? But I'm going to try to put that in like the largest possible frame, not a kind of practical frame. Okay, so let's see how this goes. So this is a little look at trends in global inequality. This is the share of personal wealth in some of the largest countries in the world. And what I want to highlight here is the overall trend downwards from 1910 down to the trough around 1980, and then the trend of increasing inequality in almost every advanced economy on this list. So we have decreasing inequality to 1980 and rising inequality thereafter. Just as a first cut, why did inequality decrease in the West and in these large economies until 1980? Well, first of all, there was massive economic growth. This was fueled by, in part, colonialism and the structure of the global economy that was created in the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution, and then also the petrochemical revolution. And you could also add in the electric revolution. These are outlined in a couple of studies of the massive growth of the 19th and 20th centuries. So you have massive economic growth coming from these like major social and technological transformations. You also have reducing inequality because of processes of democratization. The political scientist and sociologist Charles Tilly refers to democratization as a way of incorporating the forces of egalitarianism into public purpose. So part of democratization is delivering goods to a broader base of people than had happened under the aristocratic rule of previous European governance, but also the sort of feudal fiefdoms in China and Russia are also subject to this process in the 19th century. But finally, I think the most important factor from kind of a near-term perspective is the increasing power of the state during World War II. There's a massive centralization of the power in all states in the world through World War II. And so coming out of the war, the state has an outsized role in the economy. It has complete control over capital in this relationship in the early 1940s and 1950s. Capital then, if we're talking in the most abstract terms here, tries to reassert itself in the 1960s and the 1970s. But there's also a complete rewiring of global production networks. Under the auspices of the state, we get what Jeffrey Fear calls militarized globalization, which is the construction of global supply chains within the alliance network, which are designed to produce the most efficient mass production possible. So you really have a mass production economy that is created during the war in a way that hadn't been seen before. And you also get a new alliance between state power and the thermodynamics of fossil fuels, as Timothy Mitchell has outlined. And what this means is that you have an incredibly powerful state that has a ton of energy at its disposal, and it's unleashing massive economic growth, and it can really reduce inequality. And that, I want to point out, is really an exception to the historical rule of states and society. So there's a formation of a unique nexus of state power, global capital, and energy in the post-war period that makes it possible to reduce inequality. And that's not quite a real nailed down causal argument, but it'll serve the purposes of this talk. So, after 1980, you see a major rise in inequality. And there's a couple things going on there. We're seeing a rise in inequality, even though China's middle class, which you can see here in, this is Lochner and Milanovich's famous elephant graph. You can see the trunk coming up on the edge of the graph there, which shows us that basically the middle classes of the world, basically China's middle class, is doing quite well. But the US middle class, the middle class in Europe, is not doing well. And the rich are doing very well from 1988 until 2008. So we have rising inequality despite the fact that we're bringing millions of people out of poverty and into the global middle class. This is from a study from the Stockholm Environmental Institute, which kind of tries to quantify how much of carbon emissions between 1990 and 2015 how much the increase in carbon emissions is distributed across the income distribution that we just saw, and their claim is basically that 35% of global emissions increases since 1990 are attributed to the richest 5% of the global economy. And their argument there is that, we really don't have an equality of carbon emissions. We have, sort of extreme inequality. So this sort of points us to the question, which again can't be answered in the context of this talk, which is, why did inequality increase in the West after 1980? So I'm going to give a really quick answer to this question, which again is just meant to move us to the next piece of this overly ambitious talk. This is from a study by Margaret and Jonathan Hopkins called the Global Economics of European Populism. And what they're really trying to do is give us a characterization of the macroeconomic regime that made it possible to reduce inequality in the post-war era, and that which has overseen the rise of inequality in the post-war era. And the real shift here, I would say, macro regime 2, is the assertion of capital's power over the state. And the rising share of capital in GDP, and therefore the ability of them to translate of capital, broadly construed, global corporations and elite wealth holders, to basically translate their share of capital into political power. We can move here into sort of like the dynamics of inequality to get a fuller sense of what the explanation is here. And what I want to point out is that there are recursive returns to inequality. So the great political scientist and sociologist Charles Tilly again argues that existing exploitation allows those who already benefit from inequality to use their power over subordinated populations in the acquisitions of new resources, and hence new means of exploitation. So using a little bit of inequality that did exist in the 1950s and the 1960s to basically exacerbate the differences over time. This is the basic trend of inequality since the trough in the 1970s. Now, we can't outline one single causal argument for how inequality has an effect on the kinds of things that we are to identify here under the auspices of global risk and the potential for catastrophe. So what I want to point out is a couple of different pathways, many of which interact and happen at the same time. And I'm going to outline 3 here. The first is that inequality leads to state capture, which undermines, so state capture by affluent elites, which undermines problem-solving capabilities of those societies, which then undermines the legitimacy of the state as a whole. And again here, Charles Tilly is worth quoting. Inequality makes the role of governments worth fighting for, because it almost always includes, that's the inequality itself, almost always includes differences in access to violent means, which is to say that capital and particular forms of distribution are always guaranteed and underwritten by state violence, and therefore capture of the state is always a key task for those who wish to exacerbate inequality. So we have inequality leading to state capture, which undermines problem solving. We have inequality which makes distributions harder to find that everyone regards as being fair, and that leads to a lower provision of public goods. And we can also talk about the erosion of social trust, which makes it harder to find fair distributions. So let's unpack these last 2 just a little bit. I think the first one is pretty clear, but I'll unpack the second 2 pretty quickly here. So countries with higher levels of inequality have lower levels of public goods provision. This is an empirical statistical fact that has kind of been supported by the game theoretic literature, which argues that unequal groups have a harder time solving public goods provision games, such as avoiding catastrophic climate change. And the basic findings that come out of a much larger literature here are basically that if the rich are not at risk, which they're not really in climate change, they can move, they can get food, they can shirk the worst consequences of climate change, they have a lower willingness to pay for the cost. And further, if they control political institutions, there's a lower likelihood that they're going to invest in climate security, let's call it, at an optimal level. The second kind of causal pathway here is that countries with higher levels of inequality have lower levels of generalized trust. And how does this affect it? This is a great quote from the great Don Kahan piece in 2003. Individuals who have faith in the willingness of others to contribute their fair share will voluntarily respond in kind. We don't always have to be trapped in the logic of collective action. We can sometimes move people into the logic of reciprocity. But high levels of inequality erode the social trust that basically underrides the logic of reciprocity. And without trust, there's little willingness to contribute to general public goods again in society. So how does this cash out? Blythe and Hopkins basically make the argument that median income, looking at median income growth and the populist vote share, that what we're seeing is that the macro regime 2, which has generated inequality, is basically eroding support for the state as a whole. And the response is then a populist government, which claims to secure the state for the people from the elites, right? And so this general rise of populism can be as a reaction against inequality. And here's another graph showing sort of a general trend between inequality levels and populist vote share in European states. And their argument is this, that the populist wave is more than just a rejection of existing elites and a demand for attention. It's a challenge to the model of governing capitalism in which elected politicians have little capacity for acting on markets to protect people from threats to their incomes and security. Because the state has basically handed over the power to capital in a globalized economy, it doesn't have the ability to protect citizens, and the general legitimacy of the state is challenged as a result. What's really, I think, going on here is, and this is Quinn Slobodian's definition of capitalism, or of neoliberalism, which is that, you know, inequality and the subsequent pressures for populism are emerging from a systematic effort to protect capitalism from democracy. And that's how Quinn defines neoliberalism. And I think it's an apt one here. So populism is really a predictable reaction, this is Blythe and Hopkins again, to the increasingly undifferentiated policy positions of mainstream parties and the growing detachment of elected politicians from civil society. Now let's just apply this to climate change very quickly. You know, unsurprisingly, while there's lots of public goods provision in global climate politics, it tends to happen at the very local level. It tends to be California or Ontario or the northeastern United States, which tend to provide those public goods. And there just hasn't been major public goods provision at scale, either between countries or within countries. Among advanced countries, Europe has been the leader and it has the lowest levels of inequality. So I think this kind of fits the overall trend of the argument. And US political institutions, the US, the most unequal society of advanced democracies, they've been almost basically fully captured by the rich, and this has been well established by American political scientists. And of course, we know that US has lagged on climate. So we can see these general arguments about inequality cashing out in the basic way that we have seen a slow response to climate change. And basically, just to complete the argument that inequality increases the risk of catastrophe, the hedging that we see amongst rich elites in the world on climate change, which is not denying it, but not really acting with any kind of urgency or fastness, increases the risk of catastrophe. And this is a probability distribution from Wagner and Weitzman's book, Climate Shock, which shows the chance at various concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere, the chance of going over 6 degrees, which is what they define as catastrophic climate change. And you can see we're taking on non-trivial chances of catastrophic warming already, because there's really no way that we're going to be below 500 parts per million, I would say. So, I mean, let's switch the frame here to climate solutions. Is there a way to solve climate change that avoids public goods problems, that avoids trying to create a big pot of money that everybody has to contribute to? And that was basically the goal of the Kyoto Protocol under the global negotiations. One option might be to try to transition through competition. We use technological innovation to drive this process. We're going to allow capital and finance to lead, sort of aggressive capitalist financial model. And we're going to harness the power of geopolitical competition. So what Europe's basic strategy is, well, we need to reshore our value chains to keep China out of domestic, regional battery manufacturing. And harnessing that power of geopolitical competition helps create the will and the desire to really deliver major aggressive climate change. The problem with this is that it doesn't really address inequality between countries, and it doesn't really alter the basic structure of the macro regime that has overseen the increase in inequality and the basic unwillingness to really act aggressively on climate change. So I'll just conclude by posing this question. What does decarbonization that reduce global inequality look like? But I want to go back to that original frame of why we had decreasing inequality down to 1980 in the first place, which is that those were the exception. That was a particular kind of state energy hierarchy, which bucked the trend of state control over countries, which had basically marked the palace economies of the ancient world, and as well as the feudal economies of the Middle Ages world, as well as large empires in China. And Central Asia that sort of dominated in the period before the advent of modern capitalism. And after the rise of modern capitalism, we really have this tight, locked knit, alliance between state, capital, energy, which the post-World War II era is really a large exception from. So maybe there's some hope that we can harness the decentralized power of solar and wind to create a more equal society. But I would say you have to free the production of solar and wind from those global value chains and really try to think about how we're going to use technology to help us reconfigure state, capital, and energy nexuses. So I think there's a real challenge if we want to think about how to create a long-term environmental situation that is safe for humanity from the catastrophic risk that is caused by the harnessing of state power for capital in a hierarchical global order. Thank you very much.